processes that we currently have within the DOT and how that's going to transition under the NEPA assignment. We have a very good working relationship with all of the federal input agencies, the Corps, the Coast Guard, of course, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and that is going to be key going into the NEPA assignment, is making sure that we keep that good working relationship with them. I guess, as everyone knows, the NEPA assignment does not give us any shortcuts. It doesn't tell us we can eliminate this or we can eliminate that. We are going to be, for all practical purposes, FHWA. We will be the federal lead agency, and we will be, as the central office here, the single office, will be making sure that all of our work products from the NEPA process are done properly, technically correct, et cetera, legally correct before they are signed or executed. So understanding the process of how we do it is key out there, and then obviously the understanding how Fish and Wildlife does their Section 7 consultation, which is the primary purpose of the training coming up, is going to be key. Our main role as an environmental group within the department is making sure that we comply with all those particular requirements, state and federal, as projects are proposed and forwarded to our offices to go through the evaluation process. And the two areas that are very critical are species impacts, endangered species for sure, and then of course wetlands. Those two areas are key, and as far as we're concerned, it is key to the future of Florida to make sure that we do in fact analyze the alternatives and come up with the best project that we can that supports the long-term environmental aspects of the state of Florida. So, keeping with that, I'm hoping you'll learn a lot from this current prerequisite meeting, and then obviously the one with the Fish and Wildlife. We need to all be on the same page. The districts, the consultants are the ones that do these documents. The DOT, the districts, oversee that work. So everybody needs to be working as a team. We've got a lot to do, training coming down the pike as it relates to NEPA assignment, et cetera. But the district's role pretty much stays the same. You will be preparing the project. You will be doing the documents. We will be acting up here as FHWA. So making sure that everybody understands the processes. And of course, one of the critical ones, as I mentioned again, is endangered species. So we're also, I believe, as part of this course, you'll be hearing some of the things we've got proposed, some of the tools we got coming up, redoing the PD&E scope, some of the new programs that we got coming up that will be able to track the federal processes out there as part of the NEPA assignment and part of the new FAST Act. We're going to have to monitor our progress in preparing these documents and overseeing the documents and having them done. So you'll hear new terms. I'll leave that in excellent, but a new dashboard, so to speak, where we can monitor our compliance with this new NEPA assignment. With that, I wish you well, and hopefully you'll take this opportunity, suggestions on how we might improve the process or processes. Please make that part of your feedback to us. With that, Natasha.
Great. Thank you so much, Ken. And we'll go right into Javier, and he's our Natural and Community Resources Administrator, and he's going to talk to us about the goals of our training for today.
Good morning, everyone. I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind, and you've probably heard me say this, and for you consultants, you may have heard me say this before when I've been in districts and whatnot, is that we need to make sure we connect our processes. I call it connecting the dots. Making sure that we understand the things that happen in planning and programming screen and ETDM are intricately connected to the PD&E process and even beyond that. So one of the intents of this training is to make sure that people understand that when you screen things in ETDM, you're building a progression. For you engineers out there that are taking the course, it's, think of it as an equation. Planning plus programming plus PD&E equals project. So we need to keep those things in mind and break down some of these silos that we tend to work in. one of the main points of emphasis of this training is connecting the EMOs to our permitting folks. Permit coordinators and EMO folks need to work together to make sure that all the evaluations that happen early in the process are connected all the way through, so that we're not repeating work, we're leveraging early work and things like that, so that we end up with, hopefully simpler, easier project that can be permitted in a quicker and simpler fashion. The agencies are on board with that thought process. Like Ken said, we are working intricately with Fish and Wildlife Service, the Corps, NIMS, and others to simplify our processes to the point that it becomes much simpler. The SWEPT application will be one version. We're also working on tools to make sure that the Corps, Fish and Wildlife, and others understand our project priorities so projects can advance faster. So you will be seeing a lot of these things come out that try to enhance that connectivity and to help you guys connect yourselves better with the other aspects of your own offices in the districts. So with that, one of the things we want is, again, enhance that communication and understanding between the environmental disciplines. We also want you guys to take a role in helping us do things better, so share those best practices from one another as well as share them up here so we can push them out statewide. And of course, finally, one of the main, the purpose of this prerequisite is to be ready for the May 17th through 19th training that the Fish and Wildlife Service training team is going to be holding. And that training has their training coordinator and has ETAP members that will be participating in that training and assisting. So with that, I'll let you guys be so you can enjoy endangered species and wildlife assessment.
Thank you, guys. All right, Harmwell. I just want to introduce and say that I've been with the department 16 years now. I started out in the design department in District 7. Did 11 years with environmental permitting, and then had a short stint in utilities, but also was part of the the permitting process during that time as well. I've been up here in the season of last year, and Fish and Wildlife has to offer us in that regard. I do understand that the gopher tortoise shown up yet, but is the project development process through the project development and compliance during these various project development phases, maybe not listed as endangered specifically, but listed species throughout the process, but our main focus will be specifically endangered species. So with that, we'll do a brief overview and kind of introduction, Section 7, and then we'll get into the ETDM process itself with the 28, the Endangered Species was signed into law. So Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act deals with interagency cooperation. Section 7A1 directs all federal agencies to utilize their authorities in the furtherance of the purposes of the Act by carrying out programs for the conservation of listed species pursuant to the Act. Where this comes into importance for DOT is actually Section 7A2, which discusses federal actions and funding with regard to listed species and critical habitat, and where it says making decisions on permit applications, actions, the emphasis, the evidence through the Clean Water Act. And 2 is going to go through the wetlands part of her presentation. But the main focus really is looking at evidence-based information, doing an analysis of the impacts and the alternatives to try to find the best ways to avoid and minimize impacts to the species or the habitat, including wetlands. So now we'll talk more about the process and kind of that flow or connecting those dots between project development on and through implementation. And so the areas you can see on the screen are kind of the all-encompassing steps that could occur, but obviously not all projects are going to have all of these steps. But I do want to do a quick overview of these steps so that everyone's kind of familiar with what we're talking about. In the planning screen evaluation, this is part of our ETDM process. We will be identifying potential listed species or habitat within the project area that could affect advancing the project in a timely manner. You might be looking for those fatal flaws, might be looking for ways to avoid and minimize impacts at this point. Again, protected species or state listed species may also be considered at this point in the early project planning. From there, we would move into the programming screen evaluation of ETDM. at this phase, we'd be having a little bit better understanding of what the potential effects are going to be to the listed species. We're going to start thinking about our scoping for PD&E. We're going to look at the existing conditions and start thinking about our environmental document. And again, protected species could be considered in this screening event as well. From there, we're going to move into the PD&E evaluation. We're going to build on the previous evaluations through ETDM by filling in information gaps, coordinating with the services, possibly FWC, on issues of concern identified in the planning and programming screen. We're going to perform impact assessments, compare alternatives. We're going to look at completing the appropriate level of protected species and habitat documentation based on the type of project that we have. And this is what Shireen will be talking about in more detail later on this morning. As we move into the design process, we're going to incorporate commitments that we may have made during PD&E. We're going to verify compliance with those commitments in the final plans and specifications and contracts packages. If there's any changes or updates identified before you make it to the actual 100% final plans, then we need to be documenting that information going through reevaluations. We need to make sure that the project, again, is meeting those state and federal regulations like Ken was talking about. And during permitting, again, that may be a point where we reinitiate consultation with the services if necessary. Then as we move into construction and maintenance, that's where we're really going to be applying a lot of commitments that are made. We're going to be making sure that the protected species and habitat commitments are met. And maintenance may not often have any sort of commitment compliance, but at times that could happen. So to talk specifically about the two screening events in a little bit more detail, we're going to do that so that we can, again, understand how those events will feed then into the project scoping and PD&E. The planning screen is kind of what we would think of as that 50,000-foot perspective. We're really at a high level. We're really looking at more of a corridor sort of thing. What are all the alternatives? We're going to, again, start identifying potential listed species or habitat within the project area that could be affected. What might stop this project? What are the fatal flaws? Early avoidance and minimization. We're probably not going to be looking at too much mitigation at this point. It's probably way too early, but you might have some potential ideas, but really what we're going to be looking at is trying to get some local knowledge, maybe doing some field reviews, preparing that preliminary environmental discussion with what we know now. And we're going to be providing that information to through what we call our environmental screening tool to our agency representatives that are going to be looking at that information. And we know that the environmental screening tool has a window, it's kind of like a window. We're using that GIS, those layers of information to start looking at what's out there in the environment, but we're also really looking to supplement that information in the computer with what we know, what's on the ground, what is our experience so far. We might not know a lot yet, but we probably have some ideas of what might be going on out there. So we're going to use the planning screen to understand the purpose and need of the project, and then understand what those potential impacts are, what the affected environment is. Again, fatal flaws, and trying to refine our alternatives and looking for that early avoidance and minimization of impacts to endangered species or habitats. Our environmental technical advisory team, again, made up of representatives from National Marine Fisheries, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, FWC. They will be looking to kind of make sure that the listed species that we think are out there. They should be kind of providing a list. If we're not sure what's out there, they should be filling in information gaps for us. Potentially, they would be identifying studies that might be needed to be done at this point in time. It could be too early for that, but they could be making some suggestions on that side of things, helping us to understand how better to avoid and minimize impacts. And then, again, moving into potential opportunities that we could do between the planning screening event and the programming screening event. So stability about doing studies and surveys and research at this point in time, but don't discount it. It's not that you can't do it, it's just that make informed decisions later. you never know where you might run across information that might help you better understand your project. So for instance, I was just reading my Florida Ornithological Society's journal the other day and ran across some information about bonneted bats. Again, it might just be something where you start doing some research, you start looking at information, you might run across something that might inform your project a little bit more, get some more detail. Maybe that will have you start making some phone calls to some other experts and getting some information that you can use to better improving into the programming screen. This is where we start narrowing things down a little bit more to that 5,000 foot perspective, but we're still, going to be looking at those potential effects. We're going to start, again, a lot in there, but again, we need to be proactive and not just completely rely on that GIS. Let's start looking at the results we're getting from the planning screen, maybe, again, do some more field reviews, boots on the ground, refining your preliminary we know is out there, what we've found since the have experts here at DOT on certain issues. Some of our consultants are pretty, proficient in certain species, and then we also have university experts that we can rely on as well. So we're really looking at this through the information that we've gathered in the past and understand what's applicable, but at the same time, we're still trying to fill in the gaps that might be existing. We want to start really thinking about the critical path schedule, especially as it results to endangered species consultation at this point. During the programming screen and kind of towards the end of that event, you're going to probably have a fair idea of whether or not you're going to be having a consultation issue. And so you want to make sure that you're getting together with your scheduler or your project manager, whoever might be in charge of making sure that there's enough time in that project schedule to adequately address your endangered species issues. It's always harder to ask for more time after the schedule's already been developed than it is to get that time, before the schedule's been finalized. So just, kind of start having those conversations. This is a good opportunity at this point during the programming screen for the environmental management office and the permitting staff to start talking to each other. This is where you might start thinking about SWOT and compressed schedules and how PD&E might end up overlapping. So the results of this event, trying to define that affected environment. Do we have something like, the Suncoast Parkway where we know we have so many gopher tortoises, we're going to be tripping an indigo snake concern. What are those issues out there? Start thinking about them. Start using the information from this event to really inform your project manager and your permitting folks and the schedulers to make sure that that's being considered. So a couple of years ago, this office conducted best management practices from some of the districts. Talk about projects that were coming up. Good for them to be able to meet with their ETA in the districts, but it's also something that could work than you would like them to sometimes. In District 7, some of this, whether it's NEPA, specifically good best practice to go and share not just the issues per project, but the overall process. Okay, so with that, hopefully nobody's offended. But see if we have any questions on the.
I think we might have a question from Robin in District 7. So Robin, I'm going to unmute you now.
Are you there, Robin?
I'm here, but I don't have a question.
Oh.
Oh, well, okay. We'll give it a second and see if anybody else has a question. All right, looks like we didn't have any questions, so thank you for taking it easy on me. We're going to move on to Margie Kirby, our State Environmental Programs Administrator, and Victor, I'm going to probably say your last name wrong, Victor Machuruza, and he's a State Environmental Development Engineer. They're going to talk about SWOT and PD&E scoping and how it relates to the ESA.
State-funded project types. We're all pretty well accustomed to the federal classes of action for state funds. It's a state environmental impact report or non-major state action. And these types of projects and how to document these types of projects are in Part 1, Chapter 10 of the PD&E manual, State Environmental Impact Report, or SEER as we know it. Okay, and here's where we start to think about how this affects our environmental coordination, in particular with species consultation. Important to note that state-funded projects, even if we're not using Federal Highway Administration funds, may still require some level of a NEPA review or NEPA analysis. If federal permits or actions are required, they will need to have their action supported through NEPA. In these cases, the FHWA does not need to be the lead federal agency, but it's hugely important to coordinate with the federal agency we're involved with at the beginning of the project development study to really establish up front how this document, how our evaluation is going to serve them in meeting their NEPA requirements. So let's see, that permitting agency may become a lead federal agency. They may take our SEER, our state document, and modify it to themselves to serve as their NEPA document. Or they may ask DOT to just go ahead and prepare the NEPA document on their behalf. So important to note, for state-funded projects only, if a federal action is required, we would do Section 106 when it comes to historic preservation, follows Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. If no federal permit or action is required, we would consult with the Division of Historic Resources rather than Section 106, a very similar process. And we would follow Section 10 of the Endangered Species Act. And hopefully we'll get some good background on that when we meet with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service next week. So, and I qualify that as state-funded only consideration because naturally if we have FHWA funds, of course we're going to be doing Section 106 and Section 7 ESA anyway. Okay, SWAT Project Scoping Form B. This is intended to be used by the SWAT team before the PD&E scope is developed, probably about a year in advance, giving the project manager time to develop their scope of services, giving the district time to do any advanced studies or work to lead towards that scope development. It's going to use all of that information Katasha talked about, EPDM screening, preliminary work, familiarity with the project, to go ahead and do a potential consideration of project environmental impacts and make some further decisions about how to advance the project. Things that can be done to move it along and take advantage of all the information we have to date. There may be technical reports, traffic studies, survey work that can be done in advance of the project development study. This is when the team will formalize how the contract will proceed in terms of overlapping design and PD&E. And this is where the high-level schedule for the project will be developed based on what we know about the project. That schedule will be shared in the scope. And this is also a chance to take a look at what the risks and key issues of the project are, develop some contingency considerations, or even, again, at this point, if advanced studies have not yet been done for, say, perhaps presence of absence of species, it's a chance to get ahead of it. SWOT consideration, it supports being able to customize, and Victor will give you how we go about doing that, and how to go about overlap, how to permitting and consulting agents. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Victor.
My name is Victor. which pretty much everybody has. And the plan is going to be working with our industry partners, particularly FITE, to present to them, to negotiate the changes which we have made. And some of the changes going to include modifying the staff hour estimation guidelines. Preliminary work which need to be done before PD&E, and those are the things which are helping us to develop the scope of services for the project. So the standard scope of services has the standard language, but we expect that it can be modified or customized tailored to the context of the project. So what do you need to develop scope of services? You need a programming summary report, as Katash has demonstrated. Here you're going to be able to identify if there are issues with species or habitats. And also you may get some ideas from ETAT reviews about alternative to avoid or minimize impact to those issues. And also you need to understand the purpose of any previous completed studies. Studies can be planned which were done before PD&E. And also, you need to do some field evaluation. Two forms which Maggie has presented, the SWOT scoping form. This is a new thing. We will be published in part 1, chapter 4. The SWOT scoping form, this bullets programming screen summary report, as well as any knowledge about completed studies or surveys and local knowledge of the project, integrated in all projects. So either activity can start ahead of a PD&E as in scoping form. These activities can involve analysis or other traffic analysis. If timing is right, so you have to, the project manager needs to work with our environmental specialists to make sure that if this can be advanced at appropriate time, not to affect the PD&E. Other items are cultural resources assessment, survey, public involvement, and contamination. And there may be other activities beyond what we are listing here, which can be considered changes which we are making now to the standard scope of services for PD&E. We are improving it, we are making it more streamlined, and also we are allowing some way to customize it, depends on the project context. We have reorganized the standard scope of services. It's going to consider activities which were advanced prior to PD&E. And also, we may consider some opportunities for overlapping PD&E and design activities. The good thing about this is going to be a web-based tool. We are working on developing a new tool, and this tool is going to be tying in the scope of services with the production schedules and the reporting and everything. So can I talk about something called SWOT? And I'll say also it's going to be integrated with the SWOT, the details to come later. The web-based tool is going to have a series of questions to be answered by whoever is preparing the scope, or him or her project manager. But we expect that person who is going to be preparing the scope of services to work with environmental specialists, especially in issues related to ESA. So as a lot of people have been asking me about this too, yet to reveal them to a later date, beginning of the summer. But this is a comparison to come later, but if you have reviewed our proposed, create some items, that will be overlapping according to so project requirements much better than sub requirements. And other activities remain to be the same, except we remove the environmental document, which can be a SIA or a Type 2 CE, EA or EIS in one section. Miscellaneous services in the current scope of services, we took some of that information, we put it under project requirement, and the only item left is a method of compensation. And then we added another item for design services when your project is going to be overlapping PD&E and design. So a plan is to have like a two-part scope of services for all projects which are overlapping PD&E and design, because we cannot control the other portion of the design scope of services. But we are working with our production support office here to make sure that whatever changes we are making, they are in agreement with their scope of services. for roadway and bridges. So as I said before, that the new and improved standard scope of services is going to be more of a SWOT-centric, and we expect that the project manager should take up a prime role. And if we are overlapping PD&E and design, probably the two project managers, one for PD&E and one for design, should work in concert from the very beginning to make sure that they use the information prepared and stored in the SWOT scoping form. And also the project manager will have an ability of modifying the language for activities which were completed before PD&E, as well as modifying engineering activities in PD&E if the design phase overlaps PD&E. And what I mean by overlapping is if design phase and PD&E are performed concurrently. So the changes in terms of environmental analysis, we consider complexity of the project. So the project manager may modify the language based on the complexity of the project, level of environmental controversy, based on ETDM program summary screen report. Also potential for significant impacts. This also is related to the knowledge of the area, degree and the quality of known information or data, or this can be considered while the project managers are customizing the scope of services to their project. Also, the project manager may modify activities if were prepared and completed before PD&E or will be done in-house. So some of the districts had came to us and told us that, we have some activities which we would like to keep in-house, so we provide that flexibility. If the activity is done in-house, the project manager may remove that from the scope of services and say that it's going to be completed by others. If it's done by in-house consultant or district-wide consultant, or they can say that the department will provide that service or the product from that activity. And then it's going to help the consultant team to communicate data, project expectation. We still think that there may be some innovation from consultants when they are looking for this scope of services for their projects. So this slide here shows some of the text, the new text in the scope of services we are preparing to scope prepare. Again, they have to use information from program names, screen summary report, and previous completed activities to complete this scope of services. So we kind of are giving instruction on how to do it. And then this is an example part is the standard, and then the yellow can be modified depends on the conditions. Is produced from the scoping tool. It's not going to have the yellow background, so we've provided the yellow background for our text. So this is pretty much I wanted to share with you, and we have more details to come. As I said, we will be meeting with industrial partners like FICE later on. Then for folks who are going to be attending Design Expo, we are going to be presenting some of this material in depth, and also we are planning to roll over some training related to development of scope of services as well as development of our project schedules, probably in the fall or early next year. We'd like to get any feedback or questions from you now.
All right, we don't have any questions. So we're just going to pause here just for 1 minute, and we'll be right back. All right, so no questions. You guys are taking it easy on Victor and Margie as well. Awesome. Okay, well, we're going to move into our next section regarding PD&E and then protected species and habitat. For this section, we're going to provide a brief overview of the process. You just heard a lot about SWOT and PD&E scoping. So now we're going to talk about how to get started with the PD&E process in more detail as it relates specifically to the Endangered Species Act. We'll talk about the steps to take and go through how to get to and through the consultation process if you need to. We're really going to be using Chapter 27 of the PD&E manual to be our guideline for understanding these steps. The chapter was recently rewritten. Those of you that are attending the training in May should have already received the most recent draft version of that chapter that has gone to forms and procedures, and as far as I know should be getting approved in the very near future. We just have a lot of chapters going through that formal process right now, but otherwise wouldn't expect any major changes to the chapter. But we're going to, again, be using that as kind of our background for how to get through the process in PD&E. We're going to talk about the natural resources evaluation, the NRE, how it can act as your biological assessment for the consultation process, but we're not going to go into too much detail about the BA specifically because that's really the 3-day training that Fish and Wildlife is going to be providing to us. We'll talk about effect determinations and carrying those on into the consultation process, and then how to go from consultation into developing commitments, and then we'll talk about the class of actions and what you need to do in terms of documentation, and that's where Shireen's going to take over talking about that as well as commitments on the project. So as we've been discussing, in general, you're going to be building upon the previous evaluations that have been done, filling in information gaps, and coordinating, when you get to that point, coordinating with the services and FWC on issues of concern, identified in planning and the programming training events. We're going to perform impact assessments and compare alternatives. We're going to complete the appropriate level of protected species and habitat documentation based on those projects and associated impacts. And this is just the chart that comes out of the Chapter 27 where, Victor and Margie were just talking about SWOT and scope development. So between EPDM and PD&E, obviously SWOT might have some more steps than just that, but that's, one place where that's going to take place, that discussion. And then there's also projects, again, that are not going to be going through the environmental screening tool or through EPDM, and we'll be touching those types of projects as well as we go through this portion of the session today. So these are kind of the topics, again, that we're going to talk about. When we get to the part about documentation and documenting our commitments correctly, I think it's really important to think about the fact that all of the effort that's gone into all these studies, all this research, all this information gathering that we've done, we've made effect determinations, we've gone through consultation, but if you're not documenting things appropriately and you're not carrying those commitments from one phase to the next and making sure that coordination is taking place, then you've done a lot of homework, but what's the point of the homework if maybe it's not documented correctly and you can't prove that you've done what you needed to do? Maybe you did your homework, but then the dog ate it, or you did your homework and you didn't turn it in. Well, you're not getting credit. So it's kind of one of those things that we really want to make sure that we focus on. So getting started, we are, expecting that the programming screening summary report is kind of a starting point. There's a lot of questions that can be asked that should inform your scoping process. The questions should inform also your project schedule that we talked about before. Again, another good point in time to start talking to the project manager. If your project manager changes from PD&E and design, you might want to start talking to both of them just to make sure, again, if you have that SWOT sort of thing going on, that everyone's informed. Your permit coordinator, again, your scheduler, make sure everyone's on the same page with how the project's going to be moving forward. Make sure you're considering seasonal periods of surveys again. Cara and skink kind of come to mind. They could require, quite a few months of time to get started and have very specific deadlines that they have to adhere to. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service might give you a small grace period, but if you're not ready to start in time to get that survey completed by the time it has to be completed, then you're really going to want to make sure you don't waste time doing it piecemeal now when you're really going to need to make sure it gets started on time the next season. So, just trying to be efficient with our time and our resources. When considering, mitigation opportunities at this point, we are encouraging innovation, but at the same time, we want to make sure that there's any statewide implications regarding, innovative mitigation strategies, that, those be approached carefully and also in coordination with the State Environmental Management Office. The Fish and Wildlife Service does have a draft mitigation policy update out there. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail later. But that's where some of that, innovation and mitigation can come into play, assuming that they're able to get their policy revisions approved here in the near future. So again, in the programming screen summary report, there's specific areas that you could be looking at. These are the different types of areas where the ETAP members are going to be commenting. Some of them may not seem obvious, but like with regard to floodplains, I've heard from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service folks that they're really interested in certain floodplain areas where there's, those kind of streams, to ensure that there's appropriate culverts to allow fish passage underneath from one side to the other. And part of the reasoning for that is for the protected mussels. And so the fish, transmit the mussels when they're in certain stages of their life. And if they don't have appropriate passage for the fish to go back and forth along the stream, then they maybe are not able to, disperse amongst the mussels as much. But anyway, that's just one area where you might not think to look for endangered species issues, but perhaps, one of the services may have made a comment about that in that section. Again, another point in time to start thinking about, state-listed species or otherwise protected species, we might call them. And while they're not specifically being addressed through Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, we do believe that they should be considered throughout the life of the project, so there's no surprises later. You'll hear, again, kind of some other points in time throughout the rest of the presentation about when these state-listed species should be considered all the way in through design and permitting. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recently issued a revised interagency cooperative policy regarding the role of state agencies in the endangered species activities. And this is just a bit of a sidebar, and some of you may be kind of familiar with this policy, but I thought it was important to bring to everyone's attention just in case there were some of you guys that were not aware of it. But basically, the service, the changes that they made in their policy was that the service was going to spend more time kind of focusing on and cooperating with the state agencies to be kind of more proactive in terms of dealing with imperiled species before they become endangered species, which is good for everyone in the long run. They're looking for opportunities on recovery, which again, end result would be hopefully delisting, which also would be good for everybody in the long run. And then improved planning with state agencies across the species range. So these are kind of the three specific changes that they made to their policy. And it's kind of important for us to know that they're out there doing, the Fish and Wildlife Service is coordinating with the state. We've heard from FWC that they are kind of, the eyes and ears sometimes for the service, because they do kind of tend to have more information or details from being on the ground more. They have local knowledge, and they might be asked to make comments or again provide that kind of filling in the gaps information for the service when they're writing their BOs. And that was already part of the policy before, was that during consultation that the service was going to inform the state of actions that were likely to adversely affect species in their state. They would potentially again be requesting information before the service finalizes their biological opinion. And they're going to be sharing that BO with the state as well once it's written. So, FWC recognizes their role in this, knowing that they don't necessarily have jurisdiction, but they do, oftentimes provide that sort of information sharing aspect. So, again, just another reminder that we are looking at projects for endangered species issues, protected species issues regardless. of whether or not they go through a NEPA evaluation or through EPDM. And again, the type of funding doesn't really matter. If you have a state environmental report, like, you know, Margie was talking about the state-only project, state-funded only projects, you're still going to go through the same data collection process. And then again, if there's no federal nexus, you don't have a federal permit for some reason, you may be going through that Section 10 consultation process, which we're not delving into here at all today. And I do believe from Fish and Wildlife we are going to hear some, but I understand it's somewhat of a nuanced process. And so again, our focus with them won't be Section 10, but they are going to be able to touch on it for a little bit. So that'll be good to hear. All right, so again, another part of the getting started into your PD&E process would be looking at Chapter 27. The purpose of the chapter is really to help you determine how to determine impacts of your protected species and habitat. It's providing, you know, guidance on preparing your documents and how to go through the Section 7 consultation with the services. It's a really good resource. I think it's important, though, to note that the way the chapter has been written is, again, about protected species and habitat versus only considering listed species. So make sure as you're reading through it, we're not just willy-nilly using the word protected versus listed. You know, we spent a lot of time looking at every single use of the word protected and every single use of the word listed. Hopefully we got them all 100% accurate, but our goal was, again, that we're really considering all species that are protected throughout the process, but at certain points along the way, only listed species will be dealt with regard to Section 7 consultation. So that's kind of how the chapter is set up. So hopefully it's not too confusing, but we're trying to make it so that you know, we are covering all particular concerns as we go through. And some of the definitions you'll see are state-specific versus federal-specific, and I just grabbed one example where we, you know, they both have the same word or set of words, but they mean different things slightly. And so it's going to be important to make sure you understand that as you're going through. And then certain definitions will also include the service, you know, says such and such. So you'll know that that's kind of a federal area versus a state area. And again, we've seen this slide already, but just a reminder that you may be going through consultation with either the Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries, and at times they have that shared responsibility. So Chapter 27 has kind of a three-pronged approach to coordination with the agencies and the services specifically. We stress early, continual, and strategic coordination. Early and continual are fairly straightforward, but they're both important. Early would include things like the EPDM process, checking back with the ETAP members to see what, you know, are their comments still valid, you know, when you start your PD&E scoping. Continual would pick up from there by coordinating with the services as you begin your field work and your surveys for PD&E and making sure you have the proper protocols in place to do your field work, and then carrying it through the end of the project development process. Strategic coordination is a little bit more deliberate. It may help you avoid impacts. It may provide more detail for developing alternatives, and it may speed up consultation if you've done a lot of strategic coordination throughout the whole project development process. But the overall goal is to be able to move to the next phase of project development as smoothly and as efficiently as possible. So again, some of these early and continual overlap with strategic, but I think that it's important to be thinking through the appropriate times to be coordinating with the agencies and the services, not just, you know, oh, all of a sudden you have a concern or an issue, but, you know, just be really having a strategy in place of when you're going to have those points of contact with them and when it's important to touch base with regard to your project development process. You'll see kind of throughout the remainder of this section of the presentation, items highlighted in green are kind of areas where we think that strategic coordination comes into play. So basically, next, okay, so we reviewed the programming screen summary report, and now we have these next steps. We're going to start determining that action area. We're going to confirm, again, which species are going to be considered. We're going to start our actual data gathering to be heading towards a analysis and natural resource assessment or biological assessment, natural resource evaluation, so that we can hopefully get to our effects determination, and then if we need to, consultation. So we're going to kind of cover these specific areas in the next few slides in more detail. So determination of your action area. Your action area is all areas to be affected directly or indirectly by the federal action, and not merely the immediate area involved in the action. This is really a good opportunity to start working with other sections. You're probably going to get tired of saying that, but the more coordination you have with people, the more informed they are and the better decisions everyone can make. But really, getting with the design folks, getting with construction to ensure your action area is properly defined. And not that you're ready to go to construction, but just that those people might have kind of some best practices of their own about, how much room does the contractor need if you're going to do a certain alternative, or how much room would there need to be for bridge construction? Is an acro bridge needed, or can they do top-down reconstruction of the bridge? Again, not something that you can nail down necessarily at this point in time, but just, having those conversations so that how, what your action area might end up being, how much area might be affected outside of what you think is your project footprint is kind of important. Does drainage or structures anticipate, maybe having to raise a bridge to accommodate hydrology or some other requirements that are new? Where does the potential impact extend? Is maintenance maybe aware of some sort of a mitigation site that might be affected or something like that? So any of the areas in the department could have some knowledge for you to help you determine your action area. And then you also want to make sure you're working with the services to make sure that they agree with what your action area is, so when you're conducting surveys and field work, you get the whole area covered. So again, there's a lot of resources out there. You guys are probably fairly familiar with all of these resources. There's some really interesting websites out there that U.S. Fish and Wildlife and National Marine Fisheries have for you to, if you need to go double check some species within the area. Again, you're probably really going to be relying on the ETAT information, but it doesn't hurt to double check. It doesn't hurt to reconfirm if you're unsure. But obviously, a website's only as good as as often as it's updated. So, you just want to make sure that if you're getting information from the website, you're also confirming with maybe your ETAT person as well, working that in both directions. But again, universities, we have a lot of great universities here in Florida, and those folks might have expertise in certain areas that are worth, consulting with if you need to. DOT staff might have some expertise, and again, our consultants obviously have a certain amount of expertise in certain areas, since they're the ones out there with boots on the ground most of the time. And then other states that have the same species may have some best practices or some innovative ways of dealing with things that maybe we haven't dealt with in the recent past. This is just an example of one of those websites that you can go to. You can get a list of species in your county or whatever, that depending on what area you're searching in. So once you've kind of got your list of species and you know your affected area, you're going to be able to start working on your field surveys. And you want to make sure you're designing the field surveys to account for the appropriate seasons, the right time of day, making sure that you're thinking about breeding, migration, foraging. Depending on the species, all of this is, relative to the particular species, so it's hard to generalize some of these things. But obviously, some of the species have specific protocols. So try not to be overly creative when there are protocols in place. The better we can follow those protocols, probably the more likely you are to get, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to buy off on your surveys. And not to say that there aren't challenging situations, that there aren't times where perhaps those protocols might seem to be confusing or maybe not applicable to your project or situation, but when you are able to follow them directly, it's probably the best approach to take if you can. And if you have an innovative way or a different way of doing something, then again, that strategic coordination up front with the services, potentially with this office, to make sure that what you're going to do is going to be adequate and not, you don't go out and do it and then you can't use it later. Again, you might want to be looking at reviewing your survey results with the service after completion versus waiting on submitting your actual NRE or biological assessment to them, just to, again, make sure that there's no surprise on once it is submitted. If you have surveys that can't be done now, that you maybe have to hold off on for whatever reason, then just make sure if you're making a commitment to do them later, that you're tracking that commitment and handing it down to the next person in line who will be responsible for ensuring that that commitment is met. We've got our information gathered, we've done our field work, and now we have to start looking at that information, determining what does it really mean? What are our effects to the species or habitat going to be? This already and permitting three-pronged report, but some of those areas overlap, as like we're talking about today with endangered species and wetlands. Some of that information overlaps, and it just is a more efficient way of presenting that information to the agencies and the services so that they can review the pertinent details that they need to do their assessments or to do their biological opinions if one is needed. So in this natural resources evaluation, again, acting as the biological assessment, you're going to have your effect determinations laid out for each species within that report. And Shireen will get into some more details in a little while about when a technical memo may be appropriate as compared to, say, a full-blown report. So you'll have to be developing your environmental baseline to start your effect determinations, and that's an analysis of the effects of past and ongoing human and natural factors leading to the current status of the species, its habitat, and ecosystem within the action area. And so it's not the same thing as existing conditions. You have to kind of consider all of these various items listed in the definition to be able to determine what your environmental baseline is. So again, we're not going to go over the the specific areas within the natural resources evaluation, which would also be your biological assessment, but these are the types of things that you would be describing. Obviously your project would have a description in there, the types of species that you're going to be impacting, the different methodology that you went through to determine what's out there, what your results were, and then again, if there are still gaps in data, if you're still unsure of information, that needs to be identified as well. Continuing on with the content, you'd be looking at explaining, evaluating your direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts, and talking about the ways that you've tried to avoid or minimize impacts. And again, that compensation side of things, the mitigation side of things, there might be times when there's obvious ways that you might be mitigating for a species. Maybe you have to buy some panther credits. Maybe you have wood stork impact and you are going to be purchasing wetland credits that would offset the wood stork impact. Obvious ones like that are pretty easy and straightforward that you can mention in your NRE. But there might be other ones that are a little bit more challenging, like Cara. And I know District 1 and District 4 are shaking their heads right now because we've had some challenges with how to handle that type of, and I'm not even sure if you would call it mitigation directly, but that's kind of, I guess, the way we would be thinking of it. So when you have those challenging situations and maybe there's not a protocol on how to handle mitigation for those species, just kind of proceed with caution. And then in addition, so you're going to be making your conclusion about the impacts, and all of this information that you presented in your NRE is going to lead to your effect determination. So when an action may pose any effect on the listed species or critical habitat, the appropriate determination is may affect. And then from there, you determine if that action is not likely to adversely affect or if it is likely to adversely affect. Not likely is defined as when the effects are expected to be discountable, insignificant, or completely beneficial. Insignificant relates to the size of the impact, generally those that could not be detected or meaningfully measured. And discountable effects are those that are very unlikely to occur. So, for example, if you have a project within the primary zone of a crested caracara, you're going to have a may affect, likely to adversely affect determination, and you're going to have to go through formal consultation. So, sometimes instead of spending time spinning your wheels, trying to, look at ways to get to a not likely effect or not likely to adversely affect determination, you may be able to go directly to that likely to adversely affect when you know that's what it really is, and start just working through the consultation process. And again, I'm not suggesting that you just give up or anything like that. If you have good reasonings for you're not likely to adversely affect, certainly make the determination you feel is appropriate. I'm just suggesting that when you know the service is going to be considering that as a likely to adversely affect, that your schedule will probably be less impacted if you just go ahead and start the process at that time. So again, I didn't go into detail, but I know you guys are pretty familiar with this. But so the not likely to adversely affect is when you end up getting informal consultation with the services, and that's you get a written concurrence back from them on that. And then if you are likely to adversely affect, then you have a formal process to go through formal consultation specifically. And when a project has no effect on a listed species or critical habitat, then concurrence on that effect determination is not required. But it's important to kind of keep in mind that you need to keep your kind of finger on the pulse of the project in case there are changes made during design or later on that could affect that effect determination and could change the effect determination. And maybe you will need to reevaluate that in the future and have consultation on that species perhaps. So just keep those species in mind as you move forward. So the Endangered Species Act, requires best scientific and commercial data that's available, and that's what you should be using to analyze and to have gotten to the point that you're making your effect determinations. Documentation should be logical, objective, and presented with supporting evidence to justify your effect determinations. And the process occurs for each species or each type of critical habitat within the action area. And even if there's only one may affect, likely to adversely affect then formal consultation would be triggered. You guys are probably familiar with this handbook. This is still the consultation handbook that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service uses for their staff to direct them on the process of going through the consultation with us. So for informal consultation, that's something that DOT can initiate. Then, of course, you have coordination with the service, requesting concurrence for that may affect, not likely to adversely affect determination. If they concur back, then we're done. We're good to go. And then if the service does not concur, then potentially we would look at modifications to our project. Is there more ways to avoid, minimize that impact? Or are we going to have to get with FHWA, at least until we have NEPA assignments, and ask for them to initiate the formal consultation? So this is probably another key point in terms of coordinating with others to make sure that we're making the right decisions on the project, especially if we're looking at some alternatives to the potential design or alternative that we're looking at in PD&E. For formal consultation, Again, we're using that natural resource evaluation as our biological assessment, which has to be completed before the formal consultation can begin. And again, this is where DOT has to ask FHWA to initiate the consultation with the service. They have 30 days to review your package for completeness. And then once it's complete, then there's a time to, again, spend time discussing, avoiding, and minimizing impacts to meet the project purpose. That consultation period is 90 days, and then from there, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has 45 days to write their biological opinion. And it's my understanding that they typically, will take up that whole time frame to usually write their BO. U.S. Fish and Wildlife writes that biological opinion, and it either results in no jeopardy or no destruction / adverse impact, adverse modification, and you receive an incidental take statement, which includes non-discretionary measures that you have to implement in your project. Or you would get a jeopardy determination or a destruction / adverse modification, and that would result in them issuing some reasonable and prudent alternatives. And this is, again, FHWA has initiated this formal consultation. They'll be considering this. I'm sure they'll be considering this with the department and the district. And so they're going to be looking at these non-discretionary actions. And each alternative will have these certain actions that it will have to take. And then FHWA would have to notify Fish and Wildlife of its final decision on how they're going to proceed after reviewing these reasonable and prudent alternatives for each alternative. Sorry, I got behind on my slides. Okay. So for proposed species or critical habitat, you might also have an informal conference, which is similar to the informal consultation, and you're going to be getting advisory recommendations, which are not effective until that species is listed. And this is where things get a little bit, I understand contentious or a little bit hairy, I guess I would say, for districts. It's hard to sometimes judge what's the best time for deciding to implement or not implement, as we move on from PD&E and into design and project funding becomes available faster than we think. Sometimes we get a little bit nervous about, when to include this information or include these recommendations so that we're not finding ourselves out there in construction and not having done what we need to do because a species is listed. So that's just one of those areas where you just have to continue to keep your finger on the pulse again of the project as well as the listing status and make, make determinations as you go along and do the best you can on those situations. Formal conference would be when you are likely to jeopardize a proposed species or critical habitat, and you have a very similar process to consultation, and you're going to get a conference opinion with an incidental take statement, but that take statement does not become effective until listing or designation of critical habitat occurs. So again, another time when the timing of the whole process of listing and your design and your construction is very critical. So just kind of keep those time frames in mind as you're moving forward. For candidate species or critical habitat, consultation is not required, but potentially, again, that might be an area where proceed with caution, but conservation measures that you implement into your project, especially if there's something very straightforward that doesn't necessarily cost a lot of money, might be worth considering so that you're not stopped during construction, but again, proceed cautiously. So this is where we're going to take another sidebar and talk briefly about the proposed revisions to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Mitigation Policy. The changes are being proposed due to accelerated loss of habitat, effects of climate change, and advances in conservation science. And they will be applied wherever doing so is allowed by existing statutory authority and is consistent with agency mission and established natural resource objectives. So previously this policy didn't cover Endangered Species Act, but it will now cover that, and it will be like their single umbrella policy for mitigation. the draft policy says that mitigation is an integral component of the Section 7 and 10 processes by addressing the conservation needs of listed species within the context of the action and the impacts of the action on the species. It goes on to say this policy encourages the service to utilize a broader definition of mitigation where allowed by law. And they anticipate publishing a service policy specific to compensatory mitigation under ESA that will align with the policy revisions that we're talking about right now. And the Fish and Wildlife Service does plan to issue a more detailed policies or guidance documents covering specific activities in the future. So really what they're looking at is providing, in this policy, they're looking at providing a framework for kind of what they're calling the landscape approach, you know, not just covering one species at a time, which could be a good thing. They're looking at developing a mitigation hierarchy, which is pretty much what we're all familiar with now anyway, avoiding, minimizing, and then mitigating or compensating. And their main goal really is a net gain of habitat value, and they are willing to consider, though, no net loss, but they're really pushing for the net gain. They outline their fundamental principles. Did I miss that and get on my wrong slide here? Sorry. Okay. Yep, I'm off by one slide on my notes. Sorry. The fundamental principles, again, the net conservation goal, they're providing an appropriate, what they call an appropriate mitigation sequence. They're talking about being consistent and transparent, which sounds obvious, but in that they talked about being timely and predictable and having a uniform application, which again could be really good if that's the way it works out. Durability talks about maintaining their intended purpose for as long as the impacts of the action persist on the landscape. And then the effective means that they're looking for compensatory mitigation where it's basically in place before the action occurs. So that could be challenging. They're looking at integrating mitigation planning with conservation planning. They're looking to collaborate. By that, they talked about needing to make sure that they're in the NEPA process early, which is great because that's what we already do here. And under assessment, they're talking about using planning horizons that are consistent with the duration of the impacts. That sounds like it could be challenging as well. With the evaluation species, they're saying that they will select the smallest set of species that will offset the effects of the action. And then under their habitat valuation part of the framework, they're going to, again, go through avoid and minimize, and then they'll determine the value of the compensatory mitigation that's required. We're not quite sure how they're going to do that yet, but they look at means and measures, and they have 11 components of mitigation, very similar to what the Corps has in their mitigation rules. They are considering both conservation banks in lieu fee and proponent responsible mitigation, again, which has to be conducted in advance of impacts. They do go in and say that research itself is not normally a good way of mitigating, which I think is also good for us in a couple situations. And they're going to be providing their mitigation recommendations again as early as possible, which I think, as we all know, we have some really good processes in place to make sure we're getting that input from them early. So it could be an interesting policy. We'll have to see how that moves forward. We are going to be proposing some comments, and I do believe that I've sent that out to the districts for everyone to share comments back to us if you have any. So. All right, and also getting back on track, we had mentioned briefly earlier that plants are covered under the ESA. I don't think we have to deal with that very often, but the rule does say that Fish and Wildlife may authorize plant destruction on federal lands when no other options are available, and when it has been determined through Section 7 consultation that the action will not jeopardize the continued existence of the species. And so I think one of those species that people do end up having to deal with on occasion is the Johnson seagrass. All right, so we'll talk again briefly about the state here. So we're talking about Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission. It's not as rigid as the federal process, but kind of the same sort of documentation process we would be going through to make sure that we've got all of our ducks in a row. We're still going to use the same coordination strategy as we'd be using with the services. We're going to, we want to really ensure that state protected species and habitat are considered from the earliest planning phases and carried through PD&E, design, and construction. So you can kind of see our flow chart there of how that coordination would take place. It might be hard to read, but it is in the chapter. Coordination with FWC focuses on state-listed species and habitats as well as other protected species like bald eagles or bats. In order to avoid regulatory duplication for threatened and endangered species, the following state rule applies. Activities that result in take or incidental take of federally designated endangered and threatened species do not require a permit from the Commission when authorized by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA, National Marine Fisheries Service. So, but it is important to keep in mind that some species that are federally protected may also require coordination with FWC, such as sea turtles and manatees. So as coordination with FWC progresses through the PD&E study, issues related to particular state-listed species or other protected species and habitats are addressed, and FWC decisions and decisions are documented via correspondence or other memos. FWC typically requests effect determinations similar to those made for federally listed species be made for state species. The coordination process continues throughout all of our project development phases, including developing commitments, and those are recorded in the environmental documents. So again, another point where coordinating with design and permitting can be critical. So let's talk about the schedule in a little bit more detail. It's recommended that we talked about that they have 30 days to review the NRE and make sure it's being complete. So it's probably worthwhile to send your NRE to the services before you're sending your EA, your draft EIS for public availability if you can. Make sure you include time in your schedule for DOT quality assurance review. You want to have time to not only review it, but have someone respond to comments and make sure it's complete to complete the review process. And, for informal consultation, there's not really prescribed timeframes, but my understanding is that our interagency agreement with the service does have a 30-day time frame for reviewing documents. So schedule considerations when you're looking at formal consultation. Again, we talked about the different time frames, but again, important to make sure that you're asking for that completeness confirmation instead of sending it in and assuming it's good to go. If you get that 30-day completeness, yep, I got an email back, everything's good to go, then you know that your other clocks can start. And you're not kind of waffling out there saying, well, hey, I sent it to you on such and such a date, and it's been 180 days, what's going on? Well, I didn't get enough information. So it's not a surprise later that you didn't get enough information. And I will say I understand that there's some times where maybe you're going to be, waiting on some information from, say, like structures with regard to pile sizes or pile types or numbers of piles and things like that, and possibly, that won't be able to be completed, but when you can, it would be worthwhile to get in writing that the review's been completed and they're ready to move into consultation. And then, it doesn't hurt to follow up throughout the process as well, just to make sure that you're keeping tabs on what's going on. So Shireen's going to talk about this a little bit more in a minute. This is just kind of an overview of when you're going to be needing the NRE per type of class of action. So when you have an environmental impact statement, you're going to be doing the BA, and again, part of your NRE. Environmental assessments, depending on the level of involvement, you may be able to get away with the tech memo instead of the NRE. And the same thing for categorical exclusions, type 2 categorical exclusions. Regardless of whether or not you're doing an NRE or a tech memo, you need to be able to make sure that your documentation in your file has the information that can be provided to the services to support your effects determinations. And then just briefly, for the other classes of action, again, a tech memo may be appropriate depending on that involvement. So now I'm going to let Shireen take over. Are you going to take a break? Okay, Shireen's proposing that we take a 15-minute break and be back at what time? Okay, we're going to come back at 11 o'clock.
Yi Feng, I'm the project delivery coordinator here with CMO. I'm a natural scientist, a NEPA generalist up here in the office. I have about 9.5 years combined total with FDOT. Prior to joining CMO, I worked with District 6 for about 6.5 years in PD&E project management. Just on time management, since we're ahead of time, our goal is to keep plowing through and hopefully be able to end the webinar at 12:30. That's our goal, so we're going to get started right away. Did I miss anything? That's it. Okay, so Katasha spoke a lot this morning about projects qualifying for screening and all the good information gained from that screening effort and how you can use it in your species evaluation. Now, what about those projects that don't qualify for screening? Right, these are your type 1 CEs and your non-major state actions. Right, there's no planning or programming screen run for these projects, so there's no ETAC review. Right, so what are type 1 CEs and non-major state actions? I know many of you in the audience already know what these are. Just for the few of you who are not familiar, I'll just run through it really quickly. So what's a CE? As its name suggests, it's a categorical exclusion, which means it's excluded from the requirement to prepare an EIS or an EA. It's not excluded from the NEPA process. CEs must meet certain criteria by law. Basically, it means that you cannot have any significant impact from your action. Right, so for the next few, there are two types of CEs in Florida. There are type 1s and type 2. For the next few slides, I'll be handling type 1 CEs and non-major state actions. So what's a type 1 CE? These are specific listed actions by law that qualify them to be a type 1 CE. Right, there are two lists by law. There's what we call the C list and the D list, and they're listed verbatim from the law in Part 1, Chapter 2 of our PD&E manual, and executed programmatic agreements for categorical exclusion signed by Federal Highway and the DOT. The documentation type for a type 1 CE is your type 1 categorical exclusion checklist. And this is now an active form available from the Forms and Procedures website, and it's also included in the PD&E manual. What's different about type 1 CEs right now from other federal classes of action is FDOT has assumption or has delegation for approving these types of actions, and we've had this for a long time. And this is just a snapshot. It's where you can find these actions on the C and D list. You'll see if you go to either the programmatic agreement or the Part 1, Chapter 2, you'll see there's 30 listed actions on the C list, and these are usually non-construction types of actions, bike and pedestrian facilities, safety projects, really minor in scope. And on the D list, there are 13 items. Well, the list is 13 numbers long, but 3 are in reserve. So there's really 10 10 listed items, and again, minor actions like truck waste stations and actions like that. So let's talk about non-major state actions. As the name suggests, these are non-federal actions, and they really mimic the Type 1 CE. Again, they're discussed, as Margie mentioned, in Part 1, Chapter 10. And for the action to be considered a non-major state action, the checklist for a non-major state action typically has no checked on all of the answers, right? One of the questions on the checklist you'll see is the 7th question: will the project affect federally endangered or threatened species or their critical habitats? So that's how it's linked to species. Now, if that answer is yes, you may want to discuss internally, since this is a state project, if a CA will be required, or if you just need to do a technical memo to document avoidance. So what this all means for ESA. Again, as I mentioned, Type 1 CEs are non-major state actions. They're not screened in the ESD. There's no PD&E study or PD&E phase. But this does not mean that there will not be involvement with endangered species. Endangered species issues should be brought up during the scoping process that Marjorie initially spoke about at the SWOT scoping meetings and filling out the SWOT scoping form. For example, you may have a minor project such as a drainage swale rework. You think, okay, that's just minor, let's just check. No, but it could be in a foraging area for wood sorrel. So in the case of a Type 1 CEs, your protected species and habitat evaluation should be in sufficient detail to ensure that the project considers this resource. You don't want to just check no on that checklist. Yet if FDOT makes the no effect determination, as Natasha mentioned, that's it, you're done. If you have a may affect or not likely to adversely affect determination, then you'll need concurrence on dismantler from the services. You must really have concurrence on this, not likely to adversely affect for it to remain a Type 1 CE. If not, you may have to go through formal consultation, you may have additional documentation or surveys, technical memos may be required, more coordination, and you may even want to run it through the MICE process to see if the class of action needs to be bumped up to Type 2 or a very focused Type 1 evaluation. So without a PD&E phase or a PD&E study, how do you handle this? What do you need to do? Well, really at this point, these projects go straight to design. So you really want to review the design plans. You want to talk to the design PM. Really try to determine the scope of work that's going to occur on this project. Usually by about 60% plans, you have a good idea of what the project scope is, where the potential for species involvement may occur. I know some districts have phase review meetings. These are really awesome, and it's a good forum for environmental issues to be brought up, and you have all disciplines in the room. It's a very good practice. And when you're looking at the plans, don't just look at the footprint. You want to look at all the components of the plans, really. Look at the traffic control plans. How are they running their MOT? Look at the lighting plans. If you have a coastal road, you may want to look at maybe seated or friendly lighting in those areas. So for Type 1, a non-major state action, you still need documentation. You have agency coordination you may be required to determine your effect, or concurrence on your effects determination. You may have technical studies or surveys. It's very important to maintain this documentation in the project file as backup information. It doesn't need to be included in the checklist, making the checklist very long, just as backup information. Concurrence letters, GIS analysis you may have run, field notes, photos, emails, phone conversations. Just add a little note to the file that you spoke to X, Y, and Z, and so date. For type 1 CEs, the ESA question is addressed in number 7 of the type 1 CE checklist, which asks, will the action result in determination other than 1, a no involvement, 2, a no effect, or 3, with concurrence from U.S. Fish and Wildlife or NIMS that amend the determination concerning endangered species or their critical habitat? The answer really should be no if it is to remain as a type 1 CE. This is your type 1 CE checklist form. Again, there is that question 7. The first part of the form is where you would put your general project information, and number 7 is where you would check no, hopefully, that you would have no effects or no adverse effects. Now, the second part of that form is where the district EA or designee would sign to approve that type 1 CE. Before you do that, you really want to check to see if there's backup information to support that no. If any commitments or best management practices were requested, has the environmental analyst communicated their concerns with the design PM, were notes added to the plans, and just document everything. So if these are just minor projects, type 1 CEs or non-major state actions, why do we have to go through all this documentation? Well, it is important. Type 1 CEs are subject to audits by Federal Highway and self-assessments by CMO. Non-major actions are subject to quality assurance reviews by CMO. We definitely do not want to lose our assumption for type 1 projects, so it's the right thing to do. And we have been asked by Federal Highway, how do you know that there were no impacts to the species? It's important to have something that you can pull out from the file. Now, this is just a heads up. I know Ken and Margie, Victor mentioned the word SWOT, and most of you must be saying what. This is the statewide environmental project tracker. It's still under development. It's a new application CMO has developed for maintaining environmental documents and any supporting documents. Right now, it's currently set up for federal projects, but will soon be expanded for state projects. It's not released for use at this time, but you can see on the left bar how you can select your project class of action. If you select a type 1 CE, it'll bring up the C and D list, and you just click on which action you think this project qualifies, either C or D, and if it's multiple actions in one project, really try to pick the major action. Drainage, that would be the major action, and the lighting is minor. Additionally, you see the little button that says upload documents. Here is where you will be able to upload any supporting information, any GIS analysis you may have run, field notes, photographs, plan sheets with notes, scans of them, or any design modifications that the engineers made. Emails, if you have any email correspondences, you could upload the PDFs of those emails into the SWEPT tool. That's SWEPT in brief, and I'm sure you'll see more about that in the near future. So that's type 1 CEs and non-major state actions. Let's go into what's required for a type 2 CE. Right now, Type 2 CE does not fall into the Type 1 list, so there's more detailed analysis or more documentation required. Right? The document for Type 2 CE is your Type 2 CE determination form. This is not electronic yet, I don't think. For Type 2 CE, you may require a technical memo, or depending on the impacts, you may even require an NRE to be completed, kept in the project file. The information from that NRE will be summarized, the technical memo will summarized into the Type 2 CE document. Concurrence letters, again, would be referenced in the Type 2 CE document and kept in the files. If there are any federal highway findings, that would be documented in the Type 2 CE. Any commitments made during the PD&E study would be documented in the commitments section of this form. I'll get into commitments in a little bit more detail later. First here, documentation of a SEER, very similar to Type 2 CE requirements. The results of protected species and habitat evaluation is included in the environmental analysis section of the FDOT project evaluation form. As with the Type 2 CEs, you would identify any commitments related to species in the commitment section of this form. A SEER may require an NRE or just a technical memo, depending on the level of impact, so potential impact. Again, concurrence letters are maintained in the file, and the results of the concurrence summarized in the SEER document. For an EA, these are your Class 2 actions where you're not certain of the significance of your impacts. These are a little more detailed than a Type 2 CE. You would want to include a summary of the protected species and habitat section of the NRE. For an EA, you would prepare most likely a full NRE. With the impact, you document this in the impact sections of an environmental assessment. Then you would have your also your effect determinations and your recommended alternatives and avoidance measures. If your EA has more than one alternative, you may want to do this for all your alternatives because it helps in that evaluation of alternatives matrix, which projects would have the least impacts to the species. Now for an EA, if you have no impact, so you have no species present or critical habitat in the action area, you would use the standard statement provided in Chapter 27. Your comments and coordination section would include correspondence with the service, and these documents should again be kept in the project file. So should your NRE and technical memos, and you would populate your commitment section with any commitments from the NRE. Very important to transmit those commitments from the technical supporting document, the NRE, or the technical memo verbatim into the EA document commitment section. Don't just make general statements. Make sure they're there. So for an EA with FONSI, so you find that you have no significant impact, you would update your protected species and habitat information after you've held your public hearing and document the findings of if the species was in question. Now an EIS, steps to take for an EIS. Yes, there are more structured documents with specific sections. EAs are more flexible. Where would you document your species evaluation in an EIS? You start right at the top, the executive summary. Use the standard statements from Chapter 27 where appropriate, and you would put that in the executive summary if you had no effect. There's also the affected environment section. Here's where you would describe the species and habitat type, and then your environmental consequences section of the EIS, which you would include a summary of the protected species and habitat section of the NRE, present your results of the impact assessments. Again, for an EIS, most likely you'll have more than one alternative. You'll address each alternative and the impacts on species. And that's, again, used in that alternative matrix analysis. Okay, as I mentioned again, the standard statement or the finding for federally listed species. If they're not present, use that standard statement from Chapter 27. You'd want to populate your comments and coordination section with whatever coordination you did with the agencies and with Federal Highway. And more than likely for an EIS, you will prepare an NRE, and that will be maintained in the project file, but the information and findings summarized in the EIS document. Same with the EA, your commitments from the NRE and any other technical memos or assessments done, surveys, agency recommendations or commitments would be documented verbatim into the commitment section of your EIS. So what's a commitment? Like the slide says, a commitment is doing what you said you were going to do. The commitments chapter of our PD&E manual was recently revised and updated, and it's published online, so you can go check it out. FDOT has come up with a definition for commitment. It is an obligation to an external stakeholder to provide a feature or perform an action related to a project. FDOT Central Office, together with the districts, worked very hard a few years ago coming up with a project commitment tracking procedure, and it has an associated project commitment record form. Many of you may have heard about it. We call it the PCR form. It's available online at the Forms and Procedures Office. And this is our internal procedure for tracking commitments through all the phases of project development. Very important that your commitments be transmitted clearly and concisely. Now, a commitment may be established at any point during project delivery, with the exception of planning. Generally, we don't like to make commitments in planning. And you really, when making a commitment, should coordinate with all the FDOT offices involved, the construction office, even maintenance, design, to ensure that whatever we're committing to is going to be feasible and buildable. Again, you must transmit your commitments clearly and concisely. Don't be vague. Don't leave it subject to interpretation, and implement it appropriately at the right time, if it's even still feasible at the time of construction. Now, commitments should not contradict one another, which is a good thing with having that PCR form where you can see all commitments pretty much in one page or one document. If you're making a commitment in PD&E and you see something in design that's going to conflict with that commitment, you'll be able to pick that up right away and say, wait a minute, design PM. You can't move those trees. We committed to keeping them in place. When making a commitment that's unusual or unique, Natasha mentioned this could have statewide implication. You really want to loop back with the CMO office, touch base with other districts before you make that commitment, touch base with your other phase managers, make sure before you make that commitment. Commitments may be a result of consultation with the services, the species. And now they may also recommend conservation recommendations, which are non-binding, and it really should be considered very carefully before we make those recommendations. Like Natasha mentioned, if they recommend research, those are things we don't necessarily want to be involved in. Our commitment should not repeat specifications, standard specifications that are already included in our standard specs book. For example, erosion control devices, identification of unidentified areas of contamination. Those are already there. One thing to keep in mind when looking at commitments and commitment compliance, when you do your re-evaluation, really you want to reevaluate your commitments as well. The contractor may decide to change the design of the roadway and completely avoid a wetland area, and that commitment may be null and void at this time. And then you have to document why it is not going to be pursued. Some example of commitments we've made: design features meant to minimize the impacts, the adverse effects of a species resource, such as adding a shelf to a culvert or a bridge to allow for wildlife crossings, wildlife to cross. Other commitments: actions during design and permitting, for example, surveys, species surveys. And even in commitments, additional erosion control, not standard erosion control measures, that's in our specs. Maybe there's an additional erosion control measures we're going to commit to. Or manatee observers, sea turtle observers, stuff like that. Other examples of some commitments we may make: wildlife crossing commitments, as long as they meet the FDOT's wildlife crossing guidelines. You can commit to updating our species surveys just before construction. Commit to wetland mitigation to offset impacts to wood stock for foraging areas. And we can also commit to further coordination with the service in the next project phase. And I know that's a little dicey right now, but we can still commit to that for now. Now, Katasha mentioned best practices management, best practices measures earlier. I'd have to show up some more examples.
All right, so we previously had talked about one of the best practices during EPDM, but also this can kind of carry forward for all phases of project development, talking to the services and the agencies. But another example I wanted to give was District 4. Also servicing some concerns about a particular species with on projects, and they wanted that the services, kind of view of that species was there some great way of making a programmatic agreement so everyone was very clear on how that was going to be dealt with on every project moving forward. And while the end result was that we were not going to necessarily get into a programmatic agreement with the service, the district did leave with a kind of better understanding of what the service was expecting of them and what the project involvement was going to be, so that there was still a positive outcome of that meeting. So never hurts to, if you have questions, if you're really unsure about things, to touch base and just have that communication. Another example, I think we didn't move our slides, sorry about that. Another example is really talking about that commitment compliance. If it's something that you're having maybe a hard time with in your district to get others to understand the importance of, you could even consider having something in your design scope or your construction contract, maybe like your CEI contract, to really just bring that to the forefront to let folks know that it is there. It might be a good way of being able to document, not to document, but to transmit that commitment record. And, actively engaging construction, again, we've talked about a lot, but just making sure that they're aware of what those commitments are during the entire phase. Sometimes you hear things once and you're like, oh yeah, I got it, but then it's easy to forget. So the more they hear the same thing, the more likely things will be able to get addressed. We've talked a lot about these inter-office or interdisciplinary coordination. Handoff meetings are another really good way of making sure that things get transmitted properly, whether it's permit conditions or commitment compliance. Some districts have even developed something like a wildlife crossing team where you have people from maintenance and structures and drainage and design, maybe a wildlife specialist, and your project manager all involved to make sure that all issues are addressed. And I'd actually throw in utilities might be a good one to include in that group as well, because everyone has a stake in that game, really, and the more everyone has opportunity to provide their input early and at the right time, then you'll get a better product at the end. Another couple on this slide I wanted to point out is that some districts have an environmental liaison for each project. It kind of follows that project from the beginning all the way out through the end of the project. Some districts have environmental liaisons that actually can oversee construction issues as well, which is another really good best practice, especially for those of us that are normally in the office and have a hard time getting out to construction sites. It's a good way of making sure that all of those boxes are getting checked and that we're fulfilling the commitments that we said that we were going to do. And then lastly, I just wanted to point out the ERC. ERC doesn't have to be just used for plans. It could be used for reviewing environmental documents. That's what we do up here. You guys are probably pretty familiar with the fact that we do that up here. But it's a really good way of keeping all the comments on a project in one system for the life of the project. It might, be a place where someone can go back in and look at previous, discussions and previous comments and reviews, and maybe get reminded about particular situations or issues that they need some more information on. Okay, so if there's any questions on this particular section, we'll go ahead and take those. No questions. So we're going to let Sue go ahead and go into her slides then regarding wetlands and permitting.
Right. Good morning still. I was supposed to be here in the afternoon, but good morning. First off, my name is Sue Clark. I am officially the mitigation coordinator for the State Environmental Management Office. And I've been with DOT now for almost 8 years. Time really flies by. Before then, I came from the Department of Environmental Protection, where I was there for almost 9 years, and most of that time was a permit reviewer. So permitting, wetlands, and mitigation are very near and dear to my heart. All right, so let's get on. When we first started talking about this training, it just became evident as the pieces all come together, as we talk about planning, programming, PD&E, and moving on into design and so forth, and focusing on ESA, there was a part for wetlands and permitting to be discussed as they pertain to ESA. So that's going to be the focus of this next 45 minutes or so. But Chapter 18, like all the other chapters in our PD&E manual, has gone through a revision, and it's going through the formatting approval process at this time. But hopefully many of you have had the chance to review updates to Chapter 18, Part 2, Chapter 18, which is for wetlands and other surface waters. Wetlands and other surface waters provide important and beneficial functions and are a protected resource. They also provide habitat for a wide variety of species. When the department develops transportation projects, wetlands and other surface waters in project area must be assessed and documented. So in this session, we'll just explore why and how we evaluate wetlands and surface waters, how we need to coordinate findings, document those findings, and ensure that this information can be used in later phases of project delivery. We'll also talk about mitigation and how we provide compensation for unavoidable wetland impacts. All right, so as I mentioned before, they're protected and regulated by both federal and state agencies. We also have some local agencies that have been delegated that authority, but most likely for our transportation projects, we get our permits from DEP and the water management districts at the state level. At the federal level, waters of the U.S. are regulated by the Army Corps of Engineers with support from U.S. EPA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. The Rivers and Harbors Act and the Clean Water Act are two of those acts that set forth regulations for restoring and maintaining these resources. So before we kind of really get into it, we have to really talk about some definitions just so we can make sure we understand the federal perspective and the state perspective. Waters of the U.S. are defined at 33 CFR 328.3, and it's pretty much all waters. And, and you can see on this slide, all waters which are currently used, were used in the past, may be susceptible to use in interstate and foreign commerce. Their wetlands are part of that. As you can see here, sloughs, prairie, potholes, and so forth. So waters of the U.S. are very inclusive. And wetlands are also defined. Did I miss a slide? I feel like something happened here. Wetlands are also defined, and at least both the federal and state are somewhat similar, and you can see those definitions here. Areas that are inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support, and that under normal circumstances do support a prevalence of vegetation typically adapted for life in saturated soil conditions. And the state version in Chapter 373 is pretty similar as well. Surface waters are also defined by the state. So it gives that complete picture of waters of the U.S. when you have those wetland definitions and surface waters that really ties into the waters of the state definition. So now that we have definitions out of the way, let's get into some national policies. Presidential Executive Order 11990, which was established in 1977, is a policy to avoid to the extent possible the long and short-term adverse impacts associated with the destruction or modification of wetlands, and to avoid direct or indirect support of new construction in wetlands wherever there is a practicable alternative. So it was recognized back in the 70s the value of these wetlands, and therefore the president at the time established this executive order. The United States Department of Transportation followed through as well and did a preservation of the nation's wetlands order 5660.1A, which states that continues on for the protection, preservation, and enhancement of the nation's wetlands to the extent practicable as well prior to planning, construction, and operation of transportation facilities. The technical advisory further advises us and provides guidance to us of the things that we need to have evaluated. So we need to identify the type and quality of wetlands, describe the direct and indirect impacts, evaluate alternatives, and then also identify those practical measures to minimize harm to wetlands. All right, so here's the big slide I want you to really remember. In the same way Katasha and Shireen and all the others have talked about assessment of natural resources, involvement with wetlands and other surface water should be evaluated regardless of class of action. And I'll also add in here, even though I don't have on the slide, regardless of funding as well. So wetlands are important, like I illustrated earlier, both on the federal and state level. And for our transportation projects, we need to make sure we have wetlands. We need to assess them and evaluate them appropriately and provide documentation. So and just kind of to reiterate that, the applicant's handbook of the environmental resource permit requires that we take a look at wetlands, and even for those wetlands that are less than half an acre, and for the permitting folks out there, that half an acre threshold is important to us because that triggers the permit under that number. Certain, will require other types of permits. But what was interesting in the applicant's handbook for the environmental resource permit was that even for those wetlands that are less than half an acre, we need to take a look at, and particularly for those wetlands that are used by endangered and threatened species, or provide some type of value to fish and wildlife. So anytime we have wetlands, it's really important to take a look. So how do we get all this information, collect all this data? How do we put it all together? Well, as Shireen and Katasha talked about the natural resource evaluation, there should be a wetland section associated with that report. And in that section, in that wetland evaluation, these are some of the things, these are the components that should be looked at and put together for a complete wetland evaluation section. All right, first, we need to identify the wetlands in the project area, and lots of resources for that to help us. We have the environmental screening tool, the NRCS soil survey, U.S. Fish and Wildlife National Wetland Inventory, topographic maps, and area photographs. So all of these things can help us identify the wetlands in our project area. We need to delineate the wetlands as well, because that is the boundary in which the Army Corps of Engineers, DEP, and the Water Management, that is their boundary in which they have those jurisdictional responsibilities. So we need to know what we're talking about. What are those boundaries that are regulated? And then there are also tools for that too. So no creative writing here. Guidance from the Corps through the Wetland Delineation Manual. They also have a supplement that was developed in 2010. And at the state level, there's the Florida Delineation Manual from 1995, as well as the Rule 62340 for the delineation of the landward extent of wetlands and surface waters. The third element of a complete wetland evaluation should talk about, to describe the wetlands, and here you have the DOT, Florida Land Use Cover Classification System, as well as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Classification System. And all those three things really lend themselves to being described in your report, as well as being put into a map to show and illustrate where those wetlands are within our project boundary. The fourth element is to evaluate the direct and indirect effects the project will have on wetlands. So we need to look at things like flood control, erosion control, water pollution abatement, wildlife habitat value, the stability of the wetland system, and the short-term and long-term effects as well. So this helps determine the significance of the project impact on wetlands and surface waters, which is really why we're doing the wetland evaluation. There needs to be a discussion of the project's potential contribution to cumulative impacts to wetlands and other surface waters as well. But keep in mind, as we're doing cumulative effects, it's a little bit different under NEPA as opposed to those that are required under the Environmental Resource Permit Program and under Section 404 permitting that the Corps would use as well. We also need to provide a discussion of practical measures to minimize harm to wetlands and other surface waters in the project area. And we talked a little bit about those standard specifications. We can also look at maybe adjusting the alignment, maybe reducing the right-of-way, all these things to help avoid and minimize wetlands impacts. A big part of the wetland assessment is determining the functional value. So we need to determine that functional value, and we use the Uniform Mitigation Assessment Method, which is defined in 62345 of the Florida Administrative Code. This helps us to determine those functions that wetland that we are impacting would have, and also helps us to determine the appropriate mitigation that is necessary for those impacts. In speaking of mitigation, we have to take a look at the mitigation options available. And I'll dive into that a little bit more, but we really need to take a look at the wetland evaluation segment, those mitigation options, and we look at banks, the EP and Water Management District services, as well as building the mitigation ourselves. So a little bit of a segue for mitigation. So we follow Section 373.4137, which is the mitigation requirements for specified transportation projects. This is the statute that allows the department to use any state or federal mitigation options that are available to us, which promotes efficiency, timeliness in project delivery, and cost effectiveness. But before we really get into that, we need to talk about definitions of mitigation. So first is the federal mitigation, 40 CFR 1508.20. Mitigation is very inclusive. Mitigation includes avoidance, minimization, and then finally compensating for mitigation impacts. More information on mitigation can be found in the 2008 Army Corps rule under 40 CFR Part 230. Mitigation for state under state requirements is the third option after elimination and reduction of impacts. So just keep that in mind. They're just slightly different. They're nuanced terms. When we talk about mitigation, they could be slightly different from the federal perspective and from the state perspective. That mitigation definition can be found in the Environmental Resource Permit Handbook. All right, so let's talk a little bit about our mitigation options. One of a good option for us to use are to purchase mitigation bank credits. Where can we find some of these credits? They are stored by the Army Corps of Engineers in the rivet system, and those are those credits that are assessed and through permitting through the Army Corps of Engineers or through the rivet system. The state also has mitigation bank credit information that you can get from DEP or their water management districts. And how we do mitigation bank credit purchases, we go through an invitation to bid process and determine the lowest cost for mitigation for that project, and then pursue contracts or purchase orders with the appropriate vendor that wins. Keep in mind that wetland mitigation in terms of species can also satisfy species mitigation where required. For example, the example here is the wood stork. If we happen to have wood stork habitat impacts, the wetland credits can also offset those impacts for the wood stork. When those two mitigation options that I talked about are not available, I feel like I'm missing a slide here. One other option is mitigation services through our DEP and the water management districts. When we use that option, we have to coordinate very early with the water management districts. And this is very defined in Section 373.4137. The department is obligated to provide the DEP and water management districts a project inventory by July 1st of every year. And that project inventory includes 3 years of our work program. The water management districts then take that information and develop a mitigation program for us by the following year, by March 1st. So as you can see, that coordination is very important. We have to take a look at our projects. We have to vision out where mitigation services will be needed, and then work with our water management districts to make sure that the mitigation that they are offering meets our needs for our projects. All right. So finally, the permit responsible one, where we don't have mitigation banks, where the DEP and water management districts cannot provide mitigation for us, we have to take that responsibility on ourselves. So this is very time intensive. We have to plan out that mitigation. We have to look for the appropriate site to build that mitigation. Then we have to build it. Then we have to monitor it. And then we have to maintain it in perpetuity. So that permittee responsible one is very time consuming, but still very important. If that is your only option, you really need to consider that during project development so it doesn't become a hindrance at the time of permitting. All right, the final part of the wetland evaluation is the consultation and coordination with the appropriate agencies. As we had mentioned before, the NRE is that good document for consultation where appropriate and coordination with our regulatory agencies. And so the wetland part is just a continuation of that. We're going to discuss those impacts. We're going to provide an update on any draft review with those agencies. And where identified, we're going to identify the resolution as well. So all of this information is documented in this section of the wetland section of the NRE. Here's an example, as why it's important to have that discussion with DEP and the Water Management District, a specific example from the applicant's handbook. In accordance with the applicant's handbook, these agencies must look at how the project impacts wetlands and other surface waters, and also consider how the wetlands are used by fish and wildlife. So when we provide this information early on, it helps inform that permitting decision that these agencies have to make at the time of permitting. So how do we document all of this? For type 1s, I think we've shown that earlier. There's a CE checklist that needs to be filled out. For type 2s, there's a categorical exclusion determination form. With both of those, there's an avenue to provide attachments or append information to those forms. And for wetlands, you're going to want to identify those wetland impacts, identify the value of those wetlands as well, and therefore the mitigation options to offset those, and the agency coordination. For EAs and EISs, the wetland information included in the NRE should be summarized and then included in the appropriate sections of the EA and the EIS. So what about those state-funded projects, the non-major state actions, and the SEERs? They can be documented the same way as our federally funded projects. All that same information needs to be included for the NMSA and the SEERs as well. All right. The wetlands finding. As I've mentioned earlier, there is a Presidential Executive Order 11990. So for federal highway projects, we need to include wetlands finding for those projects. For type 2 CEs, that wetlands finding needs to include how the proposed project will not have a significant adverse impact to wetlands, how there is no practicable alternative to the construction in wetlands, and those measures that have been taken to minimize harm to the wetlands as well. So that information needs to be included for type 2s. For the FONSIs and EISs, there needs to be a specific reference to the executive order, as well as those other three things that I have mentioned earlier, including a standard statement. Important to include those standard statements, and you can find those in the PD&E manual, chapter 18. And then what about findings for the SEERs or NMSAs? Just like the documentation for those federally funded projects, SEERs and NMSAs, we do not have a finding per se, but all of that information is still required. We should be including the impacts, how we're going to be providing mitigation for those impacts, how we had no other option but to impact those wetlands and so forth. So although it is not required per se with standard statements and so forth, that information is still documented for the SEERs and NMSAs. All right, so keys to success. So whenever there are wetland impacts, we just have to assess them. Also take a look at those wetland-dependent species and discuss those in your wetland section as well. Document the avoidance, minimization efforts, as well as the compensatory mitigation. The NRE, make sure your wetland section is complete, and just know that that information can be used later on in permitting. And it's really important to coordinate early on. I know we've talked about that strategic coordination, making sure that permit coordinators are involved. Project managers are talking with permit coordinators and the environmental staff. If everyone does their part working together early, we can really expedite project permitting and project delivery. All right, are there any questions for this section? Okay, give me 1 minute to take a breath and we will continue on with the permitting section. All right, now for Part 12, Part 1, Chapter 12, Environmental Permitting. FDOT construction through maintenance activities are regulated by numerous environmental laws, rules, and regulations administered by federal, state, and/or those delegated local agencies. These agencies have established environmental programs to conserve, protect, manage, and control natural and cultural resources. This session will go over permitting basics, agencies involved in permitting, the rules and regulations, and how protected species are handled in permitting. So what activities require environmental permits? FDOT is required to obtain environmental permits to ensure that FDOT activities do not cause adverse impacts to protected resources. As you can see, the types of activities listed here require environmental permits. Keep in mind, unless exempted by statute or rule, permits are required for the construction, alteration, operation, maintenance, abandonment, and removal of projects. The Army Corps of Engineers and the U.S. Coast Guard are the main federal permitting agencies. It's important to recognize that some of these agencies listed here act as commenting agencies during the permit application review process. However, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife can also be a lead agency in the Section 10 of ESA permitting process. I've also listed the Advisory Council here. The Advisory Council on Historic Preservation serves as a review agency on permit applications where any district, site, building, structure, or object that is included or eligible for inclusion in the National Register may be affected. The day-to-day responsibilities for project reviews are carried out by the State Historic Preservation Officer or the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer of the Seminole Tribe of Florida for projects occurring on Seminole tribal lands. Here are some of the acts that govern how federal agencies protect resources under their jurisdiction. The Clean Water Act establishes the basic structure for regulating discharges of pollutants into waters of the United States and regulating quality standards for surface waters. The Rivers and Harbors Act prohibits the construction of any bridge, dam, dike, or causeway over or in navigable waters of the U.S. without congressional approval. The Endangered Species Act, which Katasha went through already, is to protect and recover imperiled species and the ecosystems upon which they depend. And the National Historic Preservation Act is an established program for the preservation of additional historic properties throughout the nation. So the Army Corps regulations, this is a lot, but not all of them. So I've included this here, and hopefully once you get it, the hyperlinks will work. The Army Corps has regulations they have their general policy regulations, all their different permits, of course, mitigation we talked about earlier, but this is just some of the ones that we need to follow. The Coast Guard as well has their list, and for those projects where we require bridge permits and so forth, this is some of the information where you're going to need to look for information about bridge and Coast Guard permitting. U.S. Fish and Wildlife, which Katasha talked about earlier, this is just kind of a list of some of those regulations on endangered and threatened wildlife and plants, marine mammals, migratory bird permits, and eagle permits. To kind of tie in the whole permitting aspect and protected species, I wanted to take a close look at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers general policies for evaluating permit applications. A part of their review is a public interest review, And also, as you can see here, they're required to take a look at how that permit, how that project is going to affect wetlands, fish and wildlife, water quality, historic, recreational values, coastal areas, marine sanctuaries, and also any other federal, state, and local requirements. So all those things that we talked about that we did as a part of project development, those things that were mentioned for listed species, for wetlands and so forth, they all really come together at the permitting phase. So if we hadn't done them, which we should be doing them in PD&E, we're going to have to revisit them at the time of permitting. So why not go ahead and take all of that information that we've done in PD&E and inform the permitting process. Specific to the Army Corps of Engineers and the Endangered Species Act, because they are that federal lead agency, they have the obligation under the Endangered Species Act to ensure that their agency action does not cause adverse impact to those listed species. So I don't want to read the whole thing, but this is just their obligation under the Endangered Species Act. All right, so when an FDOT project has the potential to impact federally listed species, the department will initiate Section 7 consultation. Definitely for informal consultation, we have that lead role. Until we get that NEPA delegation, we will need the FHWA to initiate formal consultation. Documentation of consultation and concurrence of effect determinations can be used and should be used during the core permitting process. So if you don't have, I mean, we've mentioned it over and over again, if you don't have that Section 7 nexus where the Army Corps is the lead agency, you would have to follow Section 10 of the Endangered Species Act. So I'll get into just a little bit of Section 10 because it's not something that we use very often, but it's not unheard of. Under Section 10, an incidental take permit is required when non-federal activities will result in take of threatened or endangered species. The applicant is required to prepare a habitat conservation plan and provide a NEPA analysis. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife will issue an incidental take permit, and more information can be found in this link. So what exactly is a part of the habitat conservation plan? All of this is identified in Section 10 of the ESA, but you're going to find some of those things we've already talked about, so it's nothing to really get too worried about in the event that we need to work with U.S. Fish and Wildlife directly for an incidental take permit. So you're going to see we need an assessment of impacts likely to result from the proposed taking of one or more federally listed species, measures the applicant will undertake to monitor, minimize, mitigate for impacts, alternative actions to taking that the applicant has analyzed and reasons why we did not pursue those, and any additional measures that U.S. Fish and Wildlife may require as appropriate or necessary. All right. So here are the typical Army Corps permits that we get for prior to the issuance of those permits. The Army Corps has to coordinate with the services to ensure species are not adversely impacted. And just to kind of reiterate, because we have done some of that coordination with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife or National Marine Fisheries, we definitely would offer up that information to the Army Corps of Engineers at the time of permitting if they haven't already been involved during PD&E. And we would hope that they use that information to inform their decision making. But specifically for individual permits, they still have an obligation to consult with the services. But of course, we hope that information will help have that dialogue between both of those agencies. For nationwide permits, we also need to make sure that threatened and endangered species are protected. A nationwide permit has general conditions the applicant must adhere to. Here's an example of a general condition with regards to endangered species. No activity is authorized under any nationwide permit that is likely to jeopardize the continued existence of a listed species. For projects that qualify under a regional general permit, SAJ 92, the department can pursue this type of permit. It applies to only non-titled projects that have less than 5 acres of wetland impact per mile up to 10 miles. For SAJ 92, the applicant must provide species concurrence from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. For state-funded projects requiring consultation, the Army Corps may take that lead role. For certain projects, we might want to pursue an FHWA NEPA 404 merger. So this is where the FHWA NEPA decision can be completed concurrently with the Army Corps of Engineers 404 decision. Under this concurrent review and approval, the Corps can use the FHWA NEPA document to make their permitting decisions. And more information on that can be found at the link provided. So what does that 404 NEPA merger look like? What are some of those things that we need to provide to both of the agencies, FHWA and to the Army Corps of Engineers, to kind of get that 404 merger going? You're going to see it's all of the information, all those things that we generally take a look at during the project development study. The project need, wetlands identification, delineation and classification, your wetlands impact assessment, the alternatives analysis, avoidance and minimization analysis, the conceptual mitigation to offset impacts, and the coordination that we do with the appropriate agencies. More information on the 404 NEPA merger can also be found in the 2015 Red Book, Synchronizing Environmental Reviews for Transportation and Other Infrastructure Projects. So the federal agencies are on board with this type of concurrent review because it expedites their decision making. It's kind of almost a one-stop shop. You talk to one agency, you talk to them all, provide the same information, and really provides us an avenue for expedited project delivery. All right, so now to our state agencies. DEP and the Water Management Districts issue environmental resource permits for our projects. They also have NPDES permits, coastal construction control line permits, sovereign submerged land permits as well, just to name a few. SWC issues species permits, but may also act as a commenting agency on ERPs and so forth. The Department of State typically acts as a commenting agency during permitting, but issues permits for archaeological testing and research. Just to kind of reiterate the importance of the Florida's endangered and threatened species information, the FWC maintains this list, so it's a good source for us to go and make sure when we have our project what species we should be taking a look at for our projects, and they're kind enough to also provide the status of federal species as well. So information on that can be found at the link provided. Here are some of the state permitting statutes and rules. Chapter 373 for water resources, 403 for pollution control, 62330 for environmental resource permitting, 62340 for the delineation of wetlands, and 62345 for mitigation. For DEP and the water management districts, as I've mentioned earlier, these are just some of the types of permits that we would need to get for our transportation projects. Specific to species regulations and how in permitting and so forth, Chapter 379.2291 is the Endangered and Threatened Species Act. It's the policy of the state to conserve and wisely manage these resources. So that's kind of the governing statute for the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. They also followed up with rules under 68A-27 for endangered and threatened species. And there's also a draft Florida Imperiled Species Management Plan that is underway that provides the status of state species and the appropriate conservation measures and so forth. But I think that's still a draft at this point, and they're still working through that. To kind of tie in the importance of looking at species and so forth, so at the time of permit, they're going to be revisited, if not already. Under the Environmental Resource Permit 62330, before the DEP and Water Management District issue environmental resource permit, they have to make sure all of these items listed will not be adversely impacted. And as you can see, value and functions to fish and wildlife is one of those issues that we need to make sure that we do not adversely impact. 62 through further, under 62330, we also have to make sure that the permit, the project that meets the public interest test, and a part of that is the conservation of fish and wildlife. All right, so when is all of this done? So we talked earlier about expediting or moving design into PD&E where appropriate. Permitting is typically handled in design, but if we are moving that earlier through coordination with the appropriate offices, we can really move permitting earlier into PD&E. But before you do all of that, you have your project managers that need to be involved, the permit coordinators, folks in the environmental management offices, and so forth. So everyone needs to be on board if this is going to be happening, advancing those design and getting permits earlier. All right, keys to success. I went through quite a bit of at least just flashes of acts, rules, and regulations. You just have to know your rules and regulations. Before you say, I don't need a permit for that, please show me where you have an exemption. It's really important to keep abreast of rules and regulations, more so than before. They seem changing quite a bit. So I know if I get word of something that's about to change from rule development or so forth, I definitely share with the permit coordinators. So all of the other folks out there, make sure you work with your permit coordinators because they will know if I know the status of rule changes and so forth. To add into that coordination, both internal and external, coordinating with the different offices is important. Coordinating all the information that we gather with our regulatory agencies at the appropriate time is important as well. Information from the environmental document and technical reports we provide, we do so much work. Let's make sure we use that appropriately at the time of permitting. We want to get involved, stay engaged, get involved even as early as planning, stay engaged all the way through design and construction. For the appropriate folks, make sure you're reviewing plans, attending design field reviews, participating in regulatory agency coordination meetings, attend project meetings, production meetings, and so forth. Stay engaged, stay involved. It takes all of us to make sure our projects are getting done correctly and efficiently. All right, are there any questions on this section for environmental permitting? Okay. All right, with that, then I'm going to pass this back over to Katasha.
All right, so we're going to wrap up here. We really only have just a handful of slides left, so I know everyone's hungry. I'm getting hungry. Just bear with us, and then we'll be concluding this training here shortly. So as Sue talked about right there at the end, and we've been stressing for this entire morning, it's very important to make sure everyone's involved. So we've gone through our design and our permitting. We're coming to the completion of design. So now what are we going to do? Again, we've done all that homework and all that hard work, and we're not just going to dump it in a file or hand it off to someone else. There's more steps that have to be taken. So, we need to be making sure we know whether or not there's changes in design. We've all been there when something comes up where the design has to change. Sometimes those changes are drastic at the end of design. We may have already gotten our permits in hand, and some of those design changes could affect our permits or could affect the consultation that we've had with the services in the past. So we may need to consider whether or not we need to reinitiate consultation. We, more importantly, are more likely to be occurring those, really focusing in on those pre-construction permit conditions and pre-construction commitments that need to be addressed. Have we bought all the mitigation credits that we need for wetlands? Have we purchased our panther habitat credits? Making sure that all that pre-construction activity has been addressed so that when we go to our handoff meeting, we can make sure construction folks have that information in their files. Potentially, we're going to have to develop specifications as well to address certain issues that may not be covered in plans or elsewhere in the contract document. Our incidental take permit is going to be needed. Again, Sue kind of talked about this a little bit, but just make sure that you're considering the timing of these permits and when you're going to be acquiring them and the impact that they might have on your schedule and how, again, they might also affect construction and the information that the construction folks need to know to make sure this is covered in the contract document. So for specifications, this is kind of a hot topic, at least in my realm these days, where we do have standard specifications that are for when we're not expecting any species involvement specifically on the project. We have these unanticipated interactions with protected species specifications covered in section 7.1.4. And really the intent is for those to be used when we've made a no effect determination, we have no real commitments to species, there's no permit conditions that relate to species. It's just totally unexpected that something related to a species interaction is going to occur. But what's good is to remind contractors that these provisions do exist and that they're aware of what they need to do. And maybe, obviously, not all species are going to apply to all projects, but you might highlight a couple that potentially they would need to be aware of so that they're not, when something does come up in their project, they're not unsure of what to do. They can act immediately and call the correct person. And then also, again, at that handoff meeting, you want to make sure that or the pre-construction meeting, you want to make sure you're working with that construction inspection group, whether it's in-house or consultant, to make sure that they know who the right contact is in the environmental permit office or the environmental management office when those sort of situations could arise. This is just where you can find those links to the specifications out there on the web. Sometimes they are hard to dig out, but they do exist. So another specification that we have in the standard specs relates to off-project activities. And as we've been stressing all day, pretty much everything we do is subject to the ESA. And so, again, in the same section, 7.1.4, this talks about issues that a contractor might run into if they are going to have, say, a staging area or they have a borrow pit they want to develop or something like that for a project. These areas need to be reviewed as well. There's some time considerations that they need to be made aware of. We're going to have to be going out in the field and conducting surveys. Maybe your consultant's going to do that for them, but they need to be aware of what's required so that they can, plan accordingly. And this applies for state-listed species as well. Modified special provisions is a tool that we have. I know you guys are probably all fairly familiar with the fact that using plan notes to address species issues is usually not going to be looked on favorably, at least for the near future. We've been kind of shying away from using plan notes that aren't really needed when there's other ways of handling that. So if your permit conditions are already covering a species issue, then there's no need because your permit is part of your contract document already. It's already something the contractors are required to follow, and you really don't want to repeat permit conditions either in specs or in plan notes because there could be a contradiction accidentally and you don't want to run into that sort of situation. But when you have some sort of requirement through, say, like an incidental take statement and a biological opinion, and you're not also having that requirement in a permit condition, you may need to cover yourself by letting the contractor know what his obligations are by putting those in what we call the modified special provision. And so, again, this can apply to state listed species as well. It doesn't necessarily just have to apply to federal. And these provisions are more or less going to reiterate what your condition is in the incidental take statement, but it may have to be modified slightly so that they're something that the contractor can understand. It may not be that they have to go out to a link on a website and read 180 pages about how to manage certain species. It needs to be kind of concise and specific for what they need to do. There may be times where that that responsibility is kind of partly DOT and partly the contractor. Maybe the contractor has to install certain erosion control measures or something, but the department is going to be the one doing reporting back. So what kind of information does the contractor need to provide to the department to ensure that we can report that their appropriate actions have taken place? When there are modified special provisions, usually the district specs office will be working with the environmental specialists to develop those. They will usually get sent up to central office specifications to be reviewed by both construction. Typically Jason Russell up here in construction will look at those, as well as myself, and we work back and forth together to make sure that not only the species aspect is covered, but that everything is very clear for the contractor, and only the information the contractor needs to know is included. They try very hard to keep any sort of extraneous information out of those specifications. If you've had the opportunity to send up a set of specifications, modified special provisions that have been approved in the past, it doesn't hurt to just try to use that same verbiage again, but you always want to double check that whatever you're suggesting for that new project is actually still consistent with whatever the project requirement is. So don't just send it up and say, oh yeah, it looks good from last time, without double checking whatever your project document says. And then, you know, as we're reviewing this, especially, I know that specs is kind of always in a rush, and I don't mean the specs office, I just mean the specs process kind of tends to get squeezed at the end. So if you need quick review, the more document information you can provide us on the background of why you're asking for this, the faster we can review this information and get you guys comments back. So this is an example. I know it's probably going to be really hard to read, but it's not critical that you can read it word for word. The point is just that these specifications have a very you know, set format and set way of them being developed by the specs office. And you know, this one is an example for Gulf sturgeon. And some of the things in here that they include are providing a trained monitor for surveillance of sturgeon. There's certain warning signs that have to be posted. You have to be super careful when you're like lowering equipment into the water, so you're not harming, like you're not dropping it right on top of a sturgeon or something like that. And then if the contractor comes across the carcass of a dead sturgeon, they have to gather up that carcass and freeze it and contact Fish and Wildlife Service, et cetera. And so, you know, those are all sort of things that are outside the norm of our incidental contact with species, but also in this particular case, we're not covered by a permit condition. So this was the application, and a spec could cover one species, or it may end up having, or modified special provision, I'm sorry, could cover one species, or it may end up covering, you know, 2 or 3 or 4 species. So. All right, so again, we talked about these construction handoff meetings and the typical things that you would want to review. Roles and responsibilities is a big one. You know, again, do you have a district person who's out in the field all the time, who's able to oversee the construction folks, that's responsible for double checking that they're, and I don't mean I mean the contractor, I don't mean our own construction folks, but you know, is someone, you know, confirming that their erosion control is in place once a month and that sort of thing, or is that something that's going to be handled in-house, and just making sure that those are very clear roles. The other thing that's good to go over at these pre-construction conferences, especially if you don't actually attend or have someone attending on behalf of your office, it's good to make sure that either you're very comfortable that your construction administrator understands the importance of your permit conditions and the importance of the other environmentally sensitive areas or considerations that need to be taken on the project. If you don't have someone that can go, make sure you're transmitting that information. But it's best if you can have someone who understands the stuff really well to be there in person. They are long. meetings generally, but they are important. Again, where you might have that over and above erosion control that Shireen talked about, maybe you're having to protect certain species, or you have super steep slopes and you don't want runoff into a stream where you might have particular species that's protected there. Just reiterating that to the contractor, making sure that all the lines of communication are open with who has to review and approve that particular erosion control plan. Maybe it's not going through the standard process of review. Looking at the species specifications again. And then really, if you need to go out in the field and meet with your contractor, or you need to have your district-wide or some other representative from your office go out there and meet with those folks, that has been something that I found to be a really good best practice. There's a lot of misunderstanding sometimes about why you're doing something. Maybe like silt fence has to be installed a particular way outside of our standards, or it's not being installed for erosion control. Maybe it's being installed for species, and maybe it's not going to be what the contractor would normally do. It doesn't hurt to go out in the field and meet with that contractor and make sure they understand and go, oh yeah, okay, I get why we're doing it this way, and they can instruct their folks accordingly. So this is, again, just similar information, making sure you're tracking your commitments on the permit tracking, on the permit commitment records, and making sure those lines of communication are open. If you have folks that you want your construction administrator to call directly, if you're hard to get a hold of, you're in meetings all day long all the time, you might have someone else that can answer questions quickly on your behalf. It might be worthwhile just to make sure that those lines of communication are open and clear. So now we're moving from final acceptance of construction into operations. And I, to kind of stress this as well, but it's not necessarily something we think about all the time, but we really do need to be making sure that any commitments we've made that maybe you're tracking on into the maintenance side of things, operation side of things, we might have that that unusual circumstance where we have our own mitigation that we're conducting, or maybe there's a wildlife crossing where we have to make sure certain maintenance activities are taking place, make sure the fence is up so that the funneling of the critters is working. All those sort of things need to be taken into consideration when we're into that operation and maintenance phase. And the same sort of rules of engagement apply here in terms of commitments and making sure that all the roles and responsibilities are understood very well.